and welcome to the video lecture series for Chapter 3, which is going to cover demand and supply. So this is our second model that we're going to learn. It's one of the most well-known models in economics. It's the famous model, right? So usually when you hear the word economics, you might think to yourself, well, I know that's about supply and demand. Well, that's what this chapter covers. So we're going to build this model over the course of Chapter 3. And then later on, we'll see in other chapters some extensions of this model. But we're going to build the basic model here today in this lecture series. All right, so to get us thinking about this, some new techniques for producing oil have generated an upsurge in oil production from 5.4 million barrels per day in 2010 to about 9 billion barrels per day today. And again, these slides are a few years old, so I think this was in 2017. Now, despite this, producers have been struggling to transport all of their oil to refineries, and this is because the government hasn't permitted the construction of pipelines linking regions of new oil production to areas with refineries. So you may have heard of the Keystone Pipeline and other pipelines like that. That's all part of this story, right? Now, in this chapter, we're going to understand what the implications of the increase in desired oil storage tanks will do. Okay, so we're going to think about this in terms of supply and demand here. So we're going to start off with demand in Section 1, and we'll talk about the law of demand. That's our learning objective for Section 1. In Section 2, we want to be able to distinguish between changes in demand and changes in quantity demanded. Okay, so those are two different things. As it turns out, demand is the curve that we will see graphically, and it's the relationship that exists between price and quantity demanded. And quantity demanded is just like it sounds. It's a particular quantity that is demanded. After that, in Section 3, we'll talk about the analogous law of supply. And then in Section 4, we'll distinguish between changes in supply and changes in quantity supplied. So basically the same thing for each side of the market. And then in Section 5, we will talk about how the interaction of supply and demand will determine equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Okay, so in Section 1, we're covering demand. Then we'll also talk in Section 2 about shifts in demand. Section 3, we'll talk about supply, and in Section 4, shifts in supply, and then we'll put the two pieces of the model together. All right, so thinking about supply and demand in another context in the real world. So did you know that the price of eggs sold in supermarkets increased by more than 100%? Now that means that the price doubled, same thing, and this happened within a 3-week period. So many people and firms, you can imagine, would respond by substituting away from egg consumption. So buying more potatoes or cereal, bagels and cream cheese, right? Things that you could substitute feasibly for eggs. So in order to kind of understand this at a deeper level, we're going to use this example. We're going to think about this with regard to supply and demand. That'll allow us to think about these problems a little bit differently and do a better job at analyzing what's going on in such a market. So speaking of markets, before we can even talk about supply and demand, we really have to first define what a market is, which is where demand and supply come together. They come together in a market. So let's make sure we understand what a market is. A market is just any or all of the arrangements that individuals have for exchanging with one another. So there's lots of examples, and hopefully you can think of at least a few in your real own life. So things like automobile markets, healthcare markets, the market for high-speed internet access. These are all examples. You should be able to think of a few on your own. And in fact, as the part for section 1 of this chapter for your discussion post, why don't you post one market that you can think of other than these 3 examples. So you should be able to give me at least one market. In fact, let's make it, give me 3 of your own examples of a market. Let's make it 3. You should be able to easily come up with 3 markets on your own. Now, probably one of the most important things that happens in markets is prices are determined in these markets. So in automobile markets, just for an example, I bought a car for myself a few weeks ago, and the seller and myself as the buyer haggled over price a little bit, and I was able to bring him down from his asking price. But that's all part of the market, is that the price, if an exchange happens, ultimately a price is determined. So that's a huge part of these markets, right? And that's a particular example. But as we'll see throughout the course, if you're in micro, prices are determined in a number of ways depending on the competitiveness of the market, and that's usually determined by how many firms are in the market. So if you're taking micro, you will see that later in the course. All right, so speaking of demand, as I already mentioned just a minute ago, demand is a relationship. It's the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So we can illustrate demand in a number of ways. One way is with what's called a schedule. So a schedule is basically just a table, and I think we'll see one on the next slide. But a demand schedule, is just a table, and it illustrates this relationship between price and quantity demanded. So necessarily, in a demand schedule, there are 2 columns. One column is price, the other column is quantity demanded. And then in each row of that table will be a price and what quantity is demanded at that price. So if you go, we'll see it in just a second here. Let's see. Let me skip ahead to one just so we can see it. No, there's one here. Here we go. All right, so here's an example of a demand schedule, right? So like I said, it's just a table. And in one column is price and the other column is quantity. There also happens to be a combination column here, but you can basically ignore that. That's for the purposes of the graph that's on the next slide. But as you can see, in the price column are different prices. And then in the quantity demanded column, there are the quantities, the quantity that is demanded at any given price. So at a price of $5 in the first row, there are 10 portable power banks demanded. Okay. Now, this whole table is a relationship, and that relationship is demand. As we're going to see in the next section, that relationship illustrated in the entire table is different than quantity demanded, which is the individual row and number in the quantity column. So 10 in the first row is the quantity demanded when the price is 5. In the second row, 20 is the quantity demanded when the price is 4, and so on. Okay, so we'll touch back on that in the next section, though. All right, let me get back to where I was. Okay, so that's a demand schedule, and that's demand. Now, we basically have something called the law of demand, and we call it a law because it's such a frequently observed and hard to deny fact of life. Okay, so I challenge you to think of something that doesn't act or doesn't respond according to the law of demand. But the law of demand is basically the fact that there's a negative or inverse relationship between price, the price of any good or service, and the quantity that is demanded at each given price. There's an inverse relationship, meaning they move in opposite directions. So if the price goes up, the quantity demanded will go down. Okay, so they're moving in opposite directions. And hopefully this is intuitive to you. Think about yourself and think of something you would buy on a typical day. Maybe maybe it's an energy drink or a snack or something like that, and think about how many you would purchase if what would change in terms of the quantity that you purchase if the price went up, if they became more expensive. Would you buy more? Would you buy a higher quantity if the price went up, or would you buy a lower quantity if the price went up? So again, the law of demand is just the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And we saw it in that demand schedule just a second ago. And so basically, ceteris paribus, which is this term we'll talk about, this Latin phrase, means other things constant. When the price of a good goes up, people buy less of it. That's quantity demanded going down. So they're moving in the opposite direction. Of course, assuming everything else is the same, nothing else has changed, just the price. And then, likewise, opposite side of the same coin, when the price goes down on something, people buy more of it, assuming everything else has stayed the same other than the price. So this inverse or negative relationship is what we call the law of demand. And we refer to it as a law because it's almost impossible to refute, and there's almost nothing in the real world that we can observe that goes against it, right? So it's kind of like the law of gravity. There's nothing readily available that we can observe that defies the law of gravity. It's almost as if it's truly a law that can't be broken. So that's why we call it the law of demand. All right, so on the last slide, I mentioned this ceteris paribus phrase. So again, it basically means that it's a Latin phrase meaning holding everything else constant. So when we talk about the law of demand and we talk about price changing, price going up, and therefore quantity demanded going down, ceteris paribus, it basically means that nothing else in the entire world is changing except for price. And that's what's causing quantity demanded to change. Okay, so that's basically what ceteris paribus means. Well, a good question is, well, what are some important things that might be relevant to demand that we're holding constant? Really, because it really only matters that we hold constant the things that will ultimately potentially change demand. In other words, the things that determine demand. Okay, so what are some of those things that we need to hold constant, since they could potentially change demand? Well, one of them's income. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense to you. Income is a determinant of demand, that relationship between price and quantity demanded. Right, so for most things, you might imagine, well, I'll ask you actually, so what do you think income does to demand? If income goes up, what happens to demand for at least for most things? Take a second and think about that. And hopefully when you thought about that, you thought, well, when income goes up, demand for things go up, right? And you would have had the right intuition. So that's good. We will talk more about what it means when demand goes up in just a second, but let's get to these other aspects that we're holding constant. So something else we're holding constant are people's tastes and preferences. So we're assuming that people's tastes and preferences aren't changing. So while price is going down, for example, people's preference for a good is not simultaneously going down, right? They start to dislike it. We're assuming that people's preferences are staying the same while price changes. Okay, so taste and preferences is being held constant. Something else that's important to hold constant are prices of other goods, right? So, and we'll see why that matters in a little bit. But then there are also, potentially many other factors. Now, there are some things that probably don't matter for demand, right? Like, I don't know, whether we're in Mercury retrograde or not, right? So I don't know if you follow, if any of you follow astrology. That's an astrology thing. Mercury retrograde. I highly doubt it has any impact on demand. And so whether or not that changes probably doesn't impact demand at all, right? It's just the placement of Mercury relative to the Earth in its orbital path. Something else that doesn't affect demand is the color of your shirt, right? Whether you're wearing a blue shirt or a green shirt is not going to change the demand for gasoline, right? So these things, we do want to hold them constant, but it probably doesn't matter if we hold them constant or not, because they probably have no real impact on demand. Whereas there are potentially many other things that could impact demand. But these are three of the major determinants of demand here. Okay. So here's a real world example illustrating the law of demand. Okay. And this is in the market for cable television subscriptions. So between 2000 and 2017, the inflation adjusted average nationwide price of a cable television subscription rose from $30 per month to about $67 per month. And during that same time, the nationwide number or quantity of cable TV subscriptions went down. So the price went up and the quantity went down from more than 68 million to just over 50 million. Now, this observation is consistent with the law of demand. That's great. One thing I will note here, though, is that we do not have our ceteris paribus assumption here, right? So between 2000 and 2017, when the price went up, there were a lot of other things also changing. Okay, so this real life example does not have our ceteris paribus assumption sort of embedded in it. So there are other things going on, right? Netflix became a thing. Amazon Prime Video became a thing. And these are substitutes for cable television, right? Roku. These are all substitutes. And so that could also be playing a role here. But it is still consistent with the law of demand, which is good. It's a real world example where we can see the law of demand playing out. All right, so another important aspect here is this concept of two different types of prices. Okay, so there's relative prices and money prices. Money prices we're very familiar with, right? Those are the normal types of prices we see in everyday life out there. Prices that are quoted in today's dollars, okay? And sometimes this is also called the absolute or nominal price. So these are normal prices, money prices. The price we're not as familiar with are relative prices, although you've probably at least heard of one or two examples in your life of a relative price. So this is basically when the price of a good is expressed in terms of another good. So for example, as it turns out in prison, a common form of money in prison is cigarettes, right? So this would be an example of a relative price, right? So and a couple of inmates might trade toilet paper for cigarettes, and the one that has toilet paper might say, I'll sell you a roll of toilet paper for 3 cigarettes. Well, the relative price of that toilet paper is 3 cigarettes, right? So that's a relative price when the price is expressed in terms of another commodity or good or service, okay? And both of these are going to be important. Understanding the difference will be important as well. Okay, so to illustrate this difference between money price and relative price, here's another example. So we've got cloud servers and external hard drives. And let's just focus on price this year, okay? Or rather, price last year. Let's focus on price last year. So price last year, cloud servers were $300. That's the money price of cloud servers last year. And the money price of external hard drives last year was $150. Okay, so those are both money prices. Now, the calculation for relative price is on the right-hand side of this table, as you can see. But basically, you just need to ask yourself, well, let's see, if I bought a cloud server last year, how many external hard drives could I have bought with that same amount of money, $300? Well, You could have bought 2 external hard drives. That's the relative price of a cloud server. Last year is 2 external hard drives. You could have bought 2 external hard drives for the same price as a cloud server last year. Okay, so 2 external hard drives is the relative price of 1 cloud server. Okay, and you can look at price this year as another example for yourself. And try to go about trying to calculate it there. So basically, as you can see in the relative price column, it's just a ratio, and we're dividing the price of the item and dividing it by the price of the other item to get relative price. So you can see in the top, let's see, the relative price column, price last year column, is 300 divided by 150, which is 2. So that's where I got that 2 answer, basically, is dividing the price of the cloud server by the price of external hard drives last year. That gives me the relative price of cloud servers. And just real quick, I'll go over one more example here. I'll go over the example of the relative price of external hard drives last year. So in that case, since we're looking at the relative price of hard drives, we're going to take the price of hard drives and divide it by the price of cloud servers. That gives us the relative price of 1/2 of a cloud server is the cost of 1 external hard drive, right? So the relative cost of 1 external hard drive is 1/2 of a cloud server. Okay, look at these other examples for price this year and use it as practice. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, so here's another example involving tips and quality adjusted prices. So consumers commonly extend tips for services, waiting table services or sometimes tax services. Why might that be the case? Well, it allows for consumers to adjust the price that they pay for say, a meal at a restaurant. It allows consumers to adjust the price they pay according to the quality of service they receive, right? So that's a nice aspect. In a sense, a tip is a price determination. How much am I willing to pay you as a customer for the service you gave me? And that tip allows restaurant customers to adjust on that quality level. They can tip more for a really high quality server, and they can tip less for a poor quality server. So what firms that allow employees to accept tips are doing is they're enabling customers to make this adjustment, so that they can adjust the price that they pay in the restaurant. They can adjust on that with the tip based on the quality of service that they receive. Okay, so it's a pretty interesting way of thinking about it. Thinking about tips as a price adjustment mechanism. Okay, so like I mentioned a few slides ago, a demand schedule is a table. So we've already seen this. But again, it's a demand schedule is a table that relates prices to quantities demanded. But there are 2 things I didn't mention and that we have to think about. So one thing is that there's a time dimension to the demand schedule. So there's a particular year that corresponds with demand. So it could be per year or it could be per week. What is the demand per year, right? So there's a time dimension, and that is not changing. And then there's also the fact that items or units that we're talking about are quality constant. They have the same quality. Every single unit that we're thinking of in a demand schedule, they are all the same quality. Okay, so that's also happening. So those are actually both ceteris paribus assumptions, as it turns out. So time isn't changing, the time frame isn't changing, and the quality of the units being demanded is not changing. Okay, so be aware of that. So we've seen the demand schedule already in the table example that we saw earlier, but we can also illustrate demand in a curve in a graph. And it turns out that this is the preferred way of doing it for most economists because the graph conveys the same information much more quickly. So, and the shape of this curve is going to be a negatively sloped line, and this is basically because of the inverse or negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay, so again, here's that schedule that we saw earlier, demand schedule. Okay, so all of these Quantities 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. The quantity of constant quality, that's kind of a tongue twister. How many units that all have the same quality are demanded of portable power banks? Okay, so all these portable power banks are identical in terms of quality, basically, is what we're talking about. And those are the quantities demanded at each given price. And we can see that inverse relationship, that negative relationship between price and quantity. Here's the demand curve, right? So the same relationship, but being illustrated in a graph. So again, the graph is just much more convenient. It's easier to use. It gives us the same information, and it gives us that information much more quickly than the table, right? If we look at the schedule, you might have to take like 4 or 5 seconds to realize that there's a negative relationship. With the curve, it's very obvious. It has a negative slope. I can tell almost instantly that the relationship between these two things on the axes have a negative relationship. Okay. Now I do have to take a second to make sure I understand the units on each axis, right? So quantity is down at the bottom, prices on the y-axis. So I do have to take a second to make sure I understand what two things are being related in this graph, but it doesn't take me that long. Prices on the y-axis, quantity or number of portable power banks is on the x-axis. Okay, and each of these points, A, B, C, D, and E, correspond with the rows in this schedule. Okay, so maybe take a second and prove that to yourself, right? All right, and to wrap up this section, we're just going to talk real quick about a distinction between individual demand versus market demand. So we can use this concept of demand on an individual level for a person like you or me, and we can talk about your demand and my demand. And when we talk about that, it would basically be the relationship for an individual, the relationship that exists for that person between price and that person's quantity demanded. So that would be an individual demand curve. Market demand curve, on the other hand, is the same concept, but the demand curve, the relationship between price and quantity demanded for the entire market, whatever the market is. So it could be the U.S. market, it could be the Atlanta market, it could be the Georgia market, right? So I'm defining markets geographically. That would be everybody, all individuals in that area, their quantities demanded, all added together. Okay, so that's the difference there. So market demand, therefore, will be much, much higher than an individual's demand, since the market demand is the totality of all individuals. Okay. All right, so that concludes this chapter. Let me illustrate this real quick, this distinction between market demand and individual demand. Okay, so to illustrate this distinction between individual demand and market demand, here is another demand schedule. So here in this demand schedule, we have price again in the leftmost column, column 1. And then in columns 2 and 3, we have two buyers' individual demand curves, or individual demand schedules, actually, in this case, since it's a table. So we see buyer 1's quantity demanded in column 2, and we see buyer 2's quantity demanded in column 3. So those are columns 2 and 3 constitute two individual demand schedules. Now, if these are the only two buyers in the market, then we can simply determine market demand by adding up their quantities demanded at each price, right? So that's what we see in column 4. We're just adding columns 2 and 3 in each row, right? So since buyer 1 and buyer 2 would both demand a quantity of 10, if the price was 5, then as a market together as a whole, we just add up 10 plus 10, that gives us 20. So that's the market quantity demanded at $5 is 20. We do that for each and every single price, add up the quantities demanded individually at each and every price, and that gives us the quantity demanded in the market. And then that relationship you see in column 4 that is market demand there, that last column. So the individual demands of the market all added together. Okay. And this is what it would look like graphically. Okay, so we see buyer one, their individual demand curve in this in panel B. Panel C is in buyer two's demand curve. And if we add them together horizontally, right, so going across for each price, adding up across horizontally, we get panel D, which is market demand. Okay, so that's what it would look like graphically. So in terms of adding up individual demands into market demand, the table actually might be a little easier, at least when there's relatively few numbers of buyers. It would become very difficult if there were many buyers. But in any case, either way, I guess it's probably easier to see how they're added up with the schedule. So that is one advantage of the schedule is looking at this distinction between individual demand and market demand. But hopefully you can convince yourself of this relationship graphically too. And as you'll notice, you'll see that the market demand, since it's higher, looks like it's pushed out further to the right. Right. So you look at panel D here, the market demand curve looks pushed further to the right, and that's because it's higher. So higher demand will imply that the demand curve is pushed to the right, and we'll talk about that in the next section actually. So. But anyway, that concludes section 1. I'll see you in the next section for section 2.